Hello, I'm Mark Edo, your moderator. Welcome to this high-level event for Rethinking Solutions for Crisis. This is UNDP's series of development dialogues that focus on crisis and fragility from a people-centered perspective. Now, this is a 90-minute interactive session, which will be in 3 parts. We'll start with an opening plenary, then we'll go to breakout sessions, and you can access those 4 breakout sessions through the Zoom links in the chat area on the YouTube channel. Then we'll come back here on YouTube or on www.developmentdialogues.org website for our final 30-minute panel. I'll also give you a summary of the key takeaways from the breakout sessions. Now, I strongly urge you to join in the discussions by typing your questions in the chat box in YouTube. Remember to include your name, your title, and your location, and I'll endeavor to pose as many questions to the speakers as I have time for. Now, the ultimate aim of UNDP's Development Dialogue series is to increase awareness of the wicked challenges of combating fragility, especially in these unusual times where COVID-19 has exposed the fragility of our systems and exacerbated risks, increased the vulnerability of all nations, and slowed down SDG achievements. This need to center on crisis and fragile contexts is already reflected in UNDP's operations and programming priorities worldwide. UNDP wants to use this platform to rethink and re-emphasize, rethink our approaches to combating crisis and fragility, and re-emphasize a people-centered approach to development with bold new approaches for a decade of action. We want to strengthen the international community's global commitment to leave no one behind. It's been approximately 1 year since the world woke up to the hard reality that it's facing the first global pandemic in 100 years. Now, at first, coronavirus seemed like the great leveler. No matter who you were or where you were, no matter your status or your wealth or lack of it, you could still be infected, and we were all locked down. Now, with hindsight, we know that COVID-19, as we now refer to it, is anything but a leveler. We are all vulnerable, but some suffer much more than others. As the death toll mounts, the virus quickly exposes the fragility of our healthcare and social systems, our labor markets, and it's pulled back the curtain and exposed how ill-prepared we were for such a shock, and how our so-called development gains are anything but. The fragility across both high and low income countries has been laid bare. UNDP's data gathering over the past 12 months reveals the severe impact on peace and development across the economic, the social, the human, the political, security, and environmental dimensions of fragility. Tens of millions more people are expected to fall into extreme poverty due to this pandemic. And UNDP has warned that the coronavirus is set to reverse human development for the first time in 30 years, with poorer economies hit the hardest. And hard-won pathways to peace and progress on human rights are being reversed in fragile and conflict-affected context. Now, the title of today's event is COVID and Fragile Contexts 1 Year On. And it asks 2 very important questions. And they're the red threads, I guess, that run through the whole of the session. What have we learned? And how can we fast-track recovery? Now, I'm delighted to have with me 3 marvelous speakers to kick things off. Hao Li-yong Zhu is the UNDP's Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of Policy and Program Support. His Excellency Ambassador Tetsuya Kimura is Japan's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. And Hilda Hardeman is the head of the European Commission's Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. Hao Li-yong, hello and welcome. I'll start with you. Can you give us your opening thoughts, please, maybe 3-4 minutes, on what we've learned 1 year on and what we need to do to swiftly recover from this crisis? You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to speak at this event on the 1-year anniversary of the declaration of COVID-19 as a global pandemic. 1 year on, we know that we must still work together to find solutions for this development emergency. As Mark noted earlier, for the first time in 30 years, Global Human Development Report has seen a decline. UNDP's analysis since mid-March last year has uncovered emerging trends in the pandemic's severe impact on peace and development. We know the coronavirus does not discriminate. However, the measures that we're taking to contain it do. So the pandemic, we know, is hitting the world's poorest and the most vulnerable people the hardest, with significant implications for marginalized groups, including women and girls. This is even more pronounced in crisis settings, as the data has shown. So addressing these challenges and making additional investments to reduce economic and social and societal vulnerabilities in the face of COVID-19 is simply critical. So I'm deeply grateful for Japan's financial support that enabled the UNDP to timely start its response to the socio-economic response to this emergency. Japan's timely funding enabled us to provide grants to 29 countries, many of which are in a fragile context. So thank you very much, Japan. And I'm pleased to note that in our role as the UN's technical lead for UN social and economic response, UNDP has worked with our partners, with sister agencies, with the RCs, and the country teams, and we have supported 121 countries to finalize the COVID-19 social and economic response national plans. So this has been a significant effort. Decision makers, require flexible, rapid, and evidence-based diagnostics to inform critical interventions and the policy decisions. So we have been able to rapidly adapt existing digital and multi-partner tools to help our countries, and provide our governments, with this comprehensive and timely information to have evidence-based, decisions. And I would like to also acknowledge the joint efforts of our partners, and the European Union that has provided the strong support to World Banks and others, in addition to UN agencies, that have been associated and assisted the governments in responding to this crisis. And I would say that we also, have adapted our own programming and taking a human rights, based approach to the pandemic, and that puts people at the center of the recovery. So we know that we cannot be driven by trade-offs between fundamental freedoms versus health, or economy versus rights. The UNDP works in partnership with the UN Office on Human Rights to prepare tools and approaches to ensure that responses to pandemic respect human rights, which will result in a better outcome in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in crisis context. So let me take this opportunity to really call on all of us to urgently draw on our experience and our resources to help countries, especially those hit by the crisis and the conflict, right, to mount an effective response to COVID-19, especially in the recovery phase, and to leave no one behind. And I also call on all of us to deliver on tools such as temporary basic incomes, for people-centered recovery, and also to call on countries, to freeze debt service payments, in countries affected by crisis and shocks. So finally, I would say that the unprecedented collaboration in science has delivered multiple safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines. For UNDP, we are working with the WHO and the UNICEF, who are the UN's leader in vaccine, but the UNDP will focus on our comparative advantages, but to focus on the deployment of digital solutions for vaccine delivery and health system strengthening. And secondly, we'll use data analytics to drive greater equity in vaccine distribution. And the focus is really to drive for equity. And finally, we will scale up in our reliable energy solutions and also environmental waste management solutions for COVID-19 vaccine drive. So let me say just the last is that let me take the opportunity to salute our valued partners, the G7 Plus group of states, for their core, to prioritize the recovery of those most left behind. And I think it's our joint effort, is our common objective. So I look forward to our discussions today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. I should mention that UNDP is publishing a podcast later today, podcast on the impact of COVID in crisis setting. That can be found on the Development Dialogue Events page. Now, Your Excellency Ambassador Kimura, you heard those words of gratitude coming from UNDP there. Your nation really must be applauded for how quickly Japan stepped up to support UNDP with financial and technical support when this COVID crisis hit. I've heard many great stories about how the impact of Japan's generosity mitigated some of the impact of COVID. For example, it was used in some places to set up safety protocols like hand washing facilities in local markets so that traders could get back to trading. Ambassador, we're all looking to build back better, or maybe build forward better, and emerge from the dark shadow of this deadly pandemic. How do you envision the road to recovery? What's Japan's approach?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, and good morning and good afternoon, wherever you may be. I would like to express my appreciation to UNDP for organizing the timely event and for giving me the opportunity to speak on this commemorative day, 1 year after the World Health Organization has declared COVID-19 a pandemic. March 11th is a day that has a special significance for Japan for another reason. March 11th, 2021 marks the 10th anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake, which devastated coastal area of northeastern Japan and claimed the lives of more than 20,000 people. Both epidemic diseases and natural disaster are human security crises, which pose serious threats not only to people's survival, but also to their livelihood and dignity. And it is often the vulnerable people who are most affected. In order to tackle both disease and disaster, we must work together to minimize their negative impacts and build back better towards a more resilient and inclusive society, where all individuals, including the most vulnerable, are able to live in dignity, duly protected, and empowered. In June of 2020, the government of Japan made a contribution to UNDP of approximately $63.6 million in order to address the human security crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The contribution covers 29 countries, and projects are deployed in alignment with the 3 pillars of the UNDP offer, namely, first, health system strengthening; second, inclusive and integrated crisis management and response; third, addressing the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19. The projects are also designed to address both protection and empowerment of the most vulnerable. Let me share some of examples of the work now being done. In Rwanda, with the support of the government of Japan, UNDP Rwanda has supported cooperatives of persons with disabilities to produce hundreds of reusable face masks to be delivered to clients. In Mali, over 260,000 reusable masks were produced for the most vulnerable persons in local communities. Working in partnership with JICA, producers of face masks were trained in Kaizen method. Kaizen method is a business concept first pioneered by Japanese producers, manufacturers, and refers to activities that seek to continuously improve all business operational functions based on input from all employees, from the CEO down to the assemble line workers. Training on Kaizen methods have assisted local mask producers to increase their business management skills. I stop there, as I understand that other successful examples will be shared in the breakout session afterwards. Finally, I would like to express that Japan is counting on UNDP's integrated approach, which includes building safety nets that takes into account economic and social impacts, while at the same time protecting and empowering the most vulnerable people in order to ensure a resilient society and build back better. Furthermore, Japan, as a devoted supporter of realizing universal health coverage, expects UNDP's activities would contribute to strengthening of the national health system, which is indispensable for the fight against the ongoing pandemic. We look forward to further discussion on how to ensure human security on the ground. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Now I'll turn to the third speaker, Hilda Hardeman, Head of the European Commission Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. Hilda, we welcome your statements now on this session's theme of the lessons we've learned 1 year on from the outbreak of COVID. Hilda.
Thank you very much. Well, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and I would like to thank UNDP and all partners for this initiative. We must work together to address the global pandemic and its impacts. This is even more important in fragile contexts, and this is an enormous challenge. Resources are limited. We must work together, put people in the center, and ensure local ownership. The international community must support common approaches for recovery with national governments in the lead. And a strong example of such an approach is the COVID-19 recovery needs assessment that promotes a shared understanding and platform to formulate a comprehensive recovery strategy. It builds on the unique trilateral partnership between the United Nations, the World Bank, and the European Union in crisis response and recovery programming. For more than a decade, we have cooperated successfully to help steer recovery processes across the globe through joint post-disaster needs assessments and recovery and peace-building needs assessments. Our dedicated COVID-19 recovery needs assessments builds on this extensive experience. It aims to align the international community behind the government-wide strategy to steer planning and financing outcomes for greatest impact. Over the past year, we have rolled this assessment out in several countries. So, to come to the question that Mark raised, what have we learned so far? First, that this assessment is really fit for purpose for complex and dynamic crises. The broad impact of COVID-19 on societies and economies requires comprehensive cross-sectoral responses. National authorities and international partners need to come together around a shared analysis and a synchronized programmatic response that allocates national budgetary resources for pandemic recovery. And this assessment has led to fast-tracking urgent measures to mitigate and preserve development gains. That's the first lesson. Second, leaving no one behind is key. The previous speakers have said it, and I will say it again. The pandemic has hit the poorest, and the marginalized have been the hardest hit. The assessment emphasizes inclusion to reduce human suffering and to lessen the risk, very real risk, of widening social fractures and increasing tensions and conflict. Strengthening social protection systems is crucial and central in the country-specific analysis. That's our second lesson. Third lesson, post-COVID recovery allows to build forward greener and better. This requires systemic changes, we know that, but these cannot and should not be deferred. Recovery strategies through the assessment emphasize the opportunities, real opportunities, to reset and pivot to a green, more risk-informed recovery, for example, through immediate investment in health, expanding social protection schemes, creating green jobs. That's the third lesson. And then finally, the assessment is a concrete example of the humanitarian development nexus, and our lessons learned show that we will want to further strengthen the peace component in this nexus. That's the fourth lesson. And this approach will be even more important as countries go into the next round of COVID response and recovery planning, where a greater focus is needed on conflict prevention, especially in fragile contexts. Clearly, COVID-19 has amplified inequalities. It's one of the biggest challenges of our time. And at the same time, this crisis is a real opportunity for building a better future and to ensure together as one world community, a better, greener, and more equitable world. And we have to make sure that we seize that opportunity and that no one is left behind. The European Union is very strongly committed to that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hilde Hardeman of the European Commission's Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. Now we're going to move on to the second half of this first panel, which is a Q&A. Now, if any questions come in, and I encourage all those watching on YouTube and on the website to post your questions into the YouTube chat, and I'll try to answer them. And I'll go across my panel, starting with Haoliang Zhu. Haoliang, I was very taken by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' speech he gave some months ago when we were right in the middle of the COVID crisis, where he challenged UN member states to reinvest in the United Nations and the global order to make it fit for purpose for these extraordinary times that we live in. And there's a very powerful quote there where he said, the pandemic has demonstrated the fragility of our world. It's laid bare risks that we've ignored for decades. Inadequate health systems, he talked about gaps in social protection, structural inequalities, environmental degradation, the climate crisis. So can you paint a brief picture of what a fragility-based post-COVID-19 recovery approach means in practice? What does it mean in practice? Of course, it's by no means one size fits all, but just try to kind of put some illustration on for us, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think this is really a complex question. I would come back really to the framework that we have, for our development, that is the sustainable development goals and the 2030 agenda. I think the fact is that the development objectives are all interconnected, right? And I think you cannot really address one issue without addressing the associated issues. But I think for development, the key question is really the individual's well-being, right? The people's well-being, and the rights-based approach to development. I think to ensure stability and the robustness of the society to withstand the shocks, I think we really need to look at what we can do to ensure that the people, the population, have the ability to deal with shocks. So that's why I think we emphasize quite a lot in the current context, measures such as temporarily based incomes, right, that can keep people still not only afloat, but secure their the development gains that they have received over the past to be able to move forward once the situation improves. So I think we needed to really use this opportunity to focus on the basic systems that are necessary for a country, for society to rebound effectively. So a fragility focused recovery plan would need to build on systems of governance, systems of financing that is critical for moving forward, and also social assistance, social protection systems that are necessary for securing human capital that has been achieved over the years. So it's really a complex issue, but I would really say, and also to take a multi-stakeholder approach, right? That you involve, the people, right, that you want to help in the decision-making process. I think if you follow, such, a multi-stakeholder approach, you focus on systems and strengthening systems. You focus on building human capital. I think that will take a country, really a long way, in the course of recovery.
Thank you, sir. I'll move now on to His Excellency Ambassador Kimura of Japan. Thank you for those opening statements there. Now, the new Japanese Prime Minister, Yoshihide Suga, was very clear when he spoke at the UN General Assembly last September that Japan wants to take a lead in the global response to COVID-19 and its aftershocks, and renewed its commitment to ensuring peace and security. I think the words he used were "leave no one's health behind." It was a very powerful comment. Now, can you crystal ball gaze for us, please, and paint a picture of what we will see from Japan next to further address the human security crisis, as it takes what you described as an integrated approach and we build back better?
Thank you very much for these pertinent questions. And as we face the current crisis and guided by the principle of human security, I think it is essential to set a goal of, as you said, leaving no one's health behind as we work towards achieving universal health coverage. I expect this to be our common goal. On this basis, Japan will proactively lead international community's effort with focus on the following three perspectives in collaboration with the international community. First, we need to safeguard lives from the novel coronavirus diseases, and Japan fully supports the development of therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics, and works towards ensuring fair and equitable access for all, including those in developing countries. Second, we must prepare ourselves for future health crises. Japan is committed to expanding this effort in developing countries to build hospitals, as well as assist strengthening health and medical systems through providing equipment and supporting human resource development. And third, we will take measures to ensure health security in more broader context. We will continue to work with other countries to improve the conditions of water, sanitation and hygiene, nutrition, and other environmental factors. In that way, we would like to work with the international community in this context. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now I'll turn to Hilda Hardman. I have a question for you. In your statement, you already mentioned the pandemic has hit the poorest and the marginalized the most. And you refer to the issue of gender. We just celebrated International Women's Day. And so, the issue of gender has been sort of top on the agenda this week. Has there been a specific impact of the pandemic on women in the countries where the COVID-19 assessments were conducted?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Well, absolutely. Women are really in the front line in this crisis, even just as health workers, of which they make up the overwhelming majority. They are strongly exposed with significant risks for their physical and their emotional health. But then further, COVID has really exacerbated the multiple layers of challenges that women and girls face: low economic participation, lack of access to credit for economic activities, poor ownership of land, high incidence of gender-based violence, to name just a few. So COVID has really meant a big setback in the already difficult situation of many women across the globe. And as predicted, violence against women has increased during the lockdown, as many women simply have nowhere to go. So if we look at our recovery strategies that are being developed through the assessment that I spoke about, most of them are explicitly gender responsive, and that's how it should be, with earmarked resources to support recovery of women-owned businesses, to prioritize social protection for women, for female-headed households, to create stringent monitoring and support to reduce gender-based violence. So the crisis has had a very strong impact on women, and we have to make sure that in our work to recover, to build back better, that we really do our utmost to give the position of women very special attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I'll have to take that as the last comment for this panel, because we only had 30 minutes and we have to move on. But I want to thank all three panelists for your very succinct and insightful interventions, your contributions there. Now we're going to move on to the second part of the program. That's the breakout sessions. There are 4 breakout sessions, and each one lasts 30 minutes. And the breakout sessions are Japan's response to COVID-19 with a focus on Libya. That's going to be led by Yasu and Hiro. An impact of COVID-19 on fragility in Iraq. And the third one is re-emerging on the development path, lessons in fast-tracking data-driven recovery from COVID-19 through socio-economic impact assessments. And the fourth and final one is impact of COVID-19 on the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's easy to join one of these 4, or jump around if you like. They're all on Zoom. You just click on the Zoom link you see in the YouTube chat. And remember, we have a second panel afterwards right here. So please come back and join us for that. And I'll also be giving you something you don't want to miss, which is a précis, just a sum up of some of the most salient points, the main points that were raised in the 4 breakout sessions you're about to enter. So enjoy, and I'll see you back here in about 30 minutes or so. Well, welcome back from the breakout sessions. I want to apologize for us having to end the Japan session early. It seemed it got hacked. You know, these virtual events are by no means perfect and foolproof, but we did get some good insights before we had to cut it short. In a few minutes, I'll share some of the most salient points that came out of the breakout sessions, which will form, by the way, part of a UNDP report. But first, I'd like to invite some opening remarks from our final closing panel. The theme of this discussion is what is needed for fragile contexts to recover. And we have two great speakers, and I urge you to keep your questions coming in. Just type them in the chat box in YouTube. Our panelists are Zina Ali Ahmad. She is the UNDP resident representative in Iraq, and you may have seen her excellent presentation with some great recommendations in the breakout session that just concluded. We also have His Excellency Abdul Habib Zadran, who is Afghanistan's Deputy Minister for Finance, but today he appears in his other role as the Deputy Chair of the G7+. Your Excellency, if you can hear me and I can hear you, I'd like to start with you. Now, the G7+ was created a decade ago to bring together countries affected by conflict and fragility, and it's done much in that time to help build resistance in the 10 years of its existence. The G7 today is releasing a discussion paper with UNDP on COVID-19, which I'd like you to tell us a little about and tell us what it hopes to achieve. You have the floor, Your Excellency. I don't know if His Excellency can hear me. Okay, it's Zaina. Okay, it seems like we're going to do it the other way around. So I'll give the floor to Zaina first, if you don't mind, Zaina, if you could unmute yourself, and then we'll go to His Excellency afterwards. We're going to swap it around again. No problem. Zaina.
Thank you, no problem. I have 5 minutes or less?
Yes, you have 5 good minutes, 5 full minutes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And yes, we had a very interesting breakout group, I have to say. I wish the time was longer because these issues require much more. But I think we will have reflections once our colleagues and our partners read this. And from your statement, what is needed for fragile contexts to recover, I'd like to say we should put forward a call for action. We've seen that the pandemic has both revealed and worsened deep economic and societal divisions in societies globally. And as we've heard from the opening remarks, it has hit the world's poorest and most vulnerable people hardest than many others. It had significant implications for marginalized groups. In countries like Iraq that are already fragile and that had political turmoil, a significant drop in oil revenue, diminished economic activity, the pandemic was another crisis layer over many crises in countries like these. We've seen that governments have asked heavy sacrifices from their people, but have all governments been acting to protect the public, for example, through preparing the health system, giving clear advice, saving lives? We've seen that this has been variable. In fragile and conflict countries, the lack of large-scale institutional interventions that aim at ensuring no one is left behind has further eroded the social contract. It has put to test the citizen-state trust. It is our opinion that to recover from COVID-19 in extreme fragile countries like Iraq, a multidimensional approach is needed that addresses the key drivers of vulnerability and fragility, whether be it economic, societal, political, security, environmental. It has to have a multi-dimensional view of this. Without this multi-dimensional approach, it would be impossible not only to meet the SDGs, but actually to put a hold on reversing the gains that have been done in these countries. And without this, we will never be able to do an inclusive development trajectory. A central element for this in our opinion, will be to focus on the building blocks for a strong social contract, as the crisis has reframed the role of the state and importantly, put a premium on citizen-state trust. We have launched this research in Iraq, and here we see that our research has shown that there are 5 key topics out of the many topics of the social contract that disproportionately affected, and with it, of course, the country's vulnerability and fragility. And let me very quickly say that these are: 1, governance, with a focus on the political system; 2 is corruption; 3 is security, with a focus on the provision of security services, but also issues of rule and of law; 4 is the provision and accessibility of basic services or lack thereof; and economic diversification, livelihoods, equality, redistribution of wealth, etc. In countries like Iraq that are very fragile, post-COVID recovery will mean that collectively we need to establish strategies and programs that integrate all the dimensions of fragility. We're talking security, we're talking political, we're talking society, etc. We need to help the country find the perfect choices to balance all of these issues together. We need to focus on supporting policies that catalyze jobs and social protection to boost productivity, but also to advocate the measures that cut fiscal deficits. These are very hard choices to make. However, there has to be an agreement on what is the chart or the way forward between the citizen and the state. Reimagining and reestablishing the terms of the social contract in fragile or post-conflict societies, in our opinion, is key to building long-lasting peace and to legitimize the new rules of the political settlement. Establishing a social contract based on social cohesion, on equality, on decreased marginalization will be key to building a peaceful and inclusive society. It will be very important to establish accountable, inclusive institutions that respond to the demand of the youth that we've seen in the streets over the last 2 years. It will be also very important to enhance relations among the different groups and strengthen the trust between the citizen and the state. There is no easy way back from the effects of the coronavirus or ISIL occupation or the political turmoil or these difficult choices, but it has pressed the reset button. It is our conviction that leaders prepared to offer competence and fairness and inclusivity through a compact between them and the citizens will have an audience again. It is not, and we hope that they will not lose this opportunity. Thank you very much.
The resident representative in Iraq. We'll hear more from you in a moment. We've got a few questions, but now we'll go to His Excellency Abdul Habib Zadran, who's with us now. You are the Deputy Chair of the G7 Plus, and today the G7 Plus is releasing a discussion paper together with UNDP on COVID-19, which I'd like you to tell us a little bit about and what it hopes to achieve. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mark. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Kabul, Afghanistan, although it's evening here. As it marks the first anniversary of this unprecedented crisis of the century, let me, on behalf of my government and the entire G7 Plus group, extend our sympathies to the victims of COVID-19. We wish a speedy recovery for those contacted by the virus, and we grieve with the families of those who have lost their loved ones to COVID-19. At the outset, I would like to thank the G7 Plus Secretariat and UNDP for conducting a joint assessment of the impact of the pandemic on the conflict-affected countries. We hope that the discussion paper will help steer the much-needed debate on how the virus has presented grim challenges for the world's poorest nations. The devastating impacts of the pandemic on the world's fragile countries have rarely been part of the global debate. I hope this paper helps ensure the fragile and conflict-affected countries are not further left behind in discourse on global recovery. The world enters the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic that has affected us all, irrespective of our region, race, or economic and political might. But its impact on conflict-affected countries have been even more daunting and immediate. As COVID-19 was declared as a pandemic, it started overwhelming the already overstretched and under-resourced health system as its direct impact. The virus, amid their most critical transition, caught countries such as those in the G7 plus group. The direct and indirect impacts of the pandemic and the associated countermeasures threaten to reverse the hard-won gains made over decades. Given the fragile peace and weak economies, the outbreak of the pandemic is more than a health crisis. It has undermined peace, security, and justice, the most precious commodity for our people. Despite the global call for a ceasefire, conflicts in some of our countries didn't only continue but were escalated. This is contrary to our expectation that the outbreak of the pandemic would at least induce solidarity and empathy on the part of insurgents, including terrorists and spoilers. My own country, Afghanistan, which stands at a critical juncture, witnessed an increased insurgency and terrorism. This includes target killing, a new tactic of our enemies to deprive Afghanistan of the cover it has built over decades. Despite the national and international plea for a ceasefire, the terrorist groups used this natural crisis for their ominous objective of killing people. Similarly, other countries witnessed riots and protests against lockdowns. Economic downturn characterized by the loss of jobs, collapse of businesses, reduction in the remittance flows, and disruption in the commodity supply chains and food system have pushed even more people to extreme poverty. Lockdowns and the closure of the borders have threatened displaced people, women-headed families, and other vulnerable population the most. They have further affected agriculture and small and medium businesses, which have been the source of livelihood for millions of our people. Our cash-strapped governments are not able to provide relief packages, a response in rich and developed countries. Overwhelmed by the political fragmentation and conflicts, institutions in fragile countries struggle to contain the flow of virus with meager resources available to them. The joint assessment is done by the UNDP and G7 Plus Secretariat as a snapshot of socioeconomic and political consequences of the pandemic on peace and well-being of the fragile countries. The socioeconomic impact of this natural crisis is indeed a global phenomenon. However, conflict-affected countries are too vulnerable to contain these impacts. Their institutions are not that resilient to stand such shocks. The majority of our population already live on hand-to-mouth economically. Imagine what would a loss of job and livelihood mean for these people. Against this background, I would like to leave you with 3 points as food for thoughts as we aspire to build back better the only light at the end of this dark tunnel. First, the pandemic has manifested a well-established fact that we live in a very well-interconnected world. Fenced and walled borders have already fallen vulnerable to avoid the spillover of conflicts and wars. So, addressing the existing wars and conflicts and preventing the same is a common public good for us. We need to quadruple our efforts and deploy all arms of diplomacy to foster peace and stability everywhere in the world, and in particular in countries like ours, which has been in war for decades. This needs to be the underlying principle of building back better the post-pandemic world. Second, the pandemic has brought to the surface the deeply rooted inequalities and fragility in systems guiding governance and corporations at all levels. The G7 Plus has spoken out loud against the inequalities and systematic failure in building lasting peace and stability even before the outbreak of the pandemic. It is time to fix our policies of engagement and make them fit for purpose. The New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States was developed to reform the way we engage in fragile states. As this year marks the 10th anniversary of the New Deal, which coincides with the first anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to review and reaffirm our commitments to its principles. Last but not least, while First Me approach has been the focus of the national policies in the developed countries, we need cooperation and solidarity more than ever. Regional and global level cooperation is indispensable to contain the common enemy, the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, the self-reliance of the conflict-affected countries is a foundation for their peace and stability. But this is almost next to impossible without the assistance of developed countries and multilateral development institutions. We therefore hope that the existing level of ODA is maintained and even made more effective. This also includes strengthening initiatives like COVAX to help these countries access vaccines. I thank you for your attention, and Mark, please accept my apologies for not being able to take the question as I had to leave for another meeting in the President's office. Thank you.
That's absolutely fine. It's a very quick session anyway. We don't have a lot of time. We have quite a few fantastic takeaways from the 4 breakout sessions. Now, this may be a little bit awkward because I'm bouncing between 2 screens here, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about what came from those breakout sessions. Remember, there were 4. There was Japan response to COVID-19 with focus on Libya. The second was impact of COVID-19 on fragility in Iraq. Then there was re-emerging on the development path, lessons in fast-tracking data-driven recovery from COVID-19 through socio-economic impact assessments. And then finally, there was impact of COVID-19 on the sustainable development goals. And there was a lot to reflect on, some powerful calls to action as well. But let me start with the session on Japan's response to COVID-19 with a focus on Libya. Here are the 3 takeaways. Number 1 was that 29 UNDP country offices expressed their appreciation to the government of Japan for the timely and flexible funding for the COVID response, and they confirmed the progress on the ground. Secondly, UNDP's Libya country office highlighted their achievements, including telemedicine, and expressed their gratitude to all the support they've been receiving from GPN and the UNDP digital office. Finally, a tripartite collaboration between the Japan unit, the GPN digital team and UNDP's regional bureau will be duplicated in other fora to support UNDP COS in resource mobilization and project management. Now I'll take the takeaways from the assessment group. There were opportunities to facilitate green transitions. Rather, opportunities to facilitate green transitions can be unfortunately missed in the recovery, given the urgency to reduce the hardship caused by the economic slowdown. Secondly, CRNA's process demonstrated the ability to facilitate an agile and well-coordinated process and informed other innovative measures. And then finally, the CRNA served as an enabler for HDP engagement, or at least the HD nexus in the case of Ecuador. The takeaways from Iraq were Iraq can't meet its SDGs without tackling fragility and its main drivers across the economic, societal, political, security and environmental dimensions during its post-COVID recovery. There was a call to advocate for a comprehensive, integrated and multi-dimensional approach for post-recovery plans, policies and financing mechanisms anchored in strong evidence-based and then those are the ones I've gotten at the moment. I don't think I've gotten any more that have come through, but as they come through, I will let you know. As we are waiting for them to be posted, if I could go back to Zaina Ali Ahmad, I was actually in your session, and you clearly said that the UNDP's RR in Iraq, it's a country where COVID has had a huge impact, enormous. And I think you articulated that and illustrated that very clearly. You mentioned earlier the need for supporting a stronger social contract in the country. Now, how do you leverage UNDP's knowledge and experience with development partners and the government to make progress in that area, Zina?
Thank you, Mark. Actually, we've launched already the process for the social contract. And let me say that the ultimate objective is not a report. The ultimate objective is to put together the choices from the voices of the Iraqis that are usually not your usual suspects and not even consulted in these forums. And we've looked at it in a way that it coincides hopefully with the elections that are coming in later this year, so that there are some policy recommendations of what do these Iraqis want, this guy who was protesting in the street, or this IDP whose house was bombed by ISIL, etc. So we've launched a process that looks at some sort of an intellectual background thinking, and I've outlined in the breakout session what's emerging as the most 5 important actions of the social contract. All of this process will now be taken to main stakeholders so that we can discuss, edit, refine, change, are they valid or not. At the same time, we're taking it to the public, to the marginalized Iraqis. We have a higher infiltration of Facebook in Iraq. So everyone who has Facebook, it's around more than 50% of the population, and their towns or villages will be able to some voice their opinions in some sort of a social media. And we are also launching a big data so that we can have a listening tool. All of this hopefully will culminate in what as an Iraqi in the street, in a village around Basra, in a village where I'm in a camp, what are the choices that I would look for in my policymakers? And UNDP is the convening around that. It's not our choices. It's not informed by us. It is actually a convening power that only UNDP has, I have to say, in countries like this, so that we can bring together all the stakeholders to look at these issues and put forth the choices that hopefully will be taken into account once we have the new cabinet. Thank you, Mark.
Zaina, I'm going to stay with you for a second. I was listening to the minister give his speech as well just before you spoke, and he was quite eloquent, quite passionate. He talked about how young people were looking for jobs on the street, where there'd been waves of young people and so many people coming to the government when it came to security issues as well. And he talked so much about that multi-dimensional faculties were exacerbating the challenges. Now, you stated that a multi-dimensional approach is needed to address some of the key drivers of that fragility. And you talked about economic, societal, political, security, and environmental dimensions. This seems like a big issue that will require a very, very comprehensive and integrated approach. I know you've spoken about it a little bit. Could you elaborate a little bit more and paint a slightly bigger picture for us?
Yeah, no, definitely it is a complex approach, let me say. In the breakout session, I also gave an example of how UNDP and other UN partners are bringing together actors around durable solutions for return and recovery. Let me give another example here to make it a little bit more real. UNDP leads on the stabilization programming, and for us, stabilization sits in between the humanitarian and development. We always say UNDP stabilization is durable solutions. It is a program that is so comprehensive and has had such an impact that it has facilitated. The storyline is that we have facilitated through that program the return of more than 4.8 million Iraqis back home. And that is immense in a period of 4 years before it becomes a protracted displacement. That program, now informed with our fragility thinking, also integrates issues of social cohesion, of reconciliation. It looks at basic infrastructure and service rehabilitation, but also through emergency employment and longer-term employment opportunities. It integrates sustainability considerations, renewable energy, gender issues, and it looks also at security sector reform. So all of these would come together in an area-based intervention to create durable solutions for the immense challenges that are faced by this country.
Zina, I want to thank you for that, for carrying the panel effectively by yourself, the Q&A. Thank you very much. It's always interesting to hear from you. And hopefully we'll get to meet all of us in person very soon. Inshallah. Okay, we've come to the end of this fascinating session. There's one thing is clear, that we need to redouble our efforts to strengthen the partnerships between the G7+, the UNDP, multilateral agencies, and donor nations. That goes without saying. I think that the center of all these conversations is where the areas for collaboration and partnership exist, because therein lie the solutions. Now, to articulate those thoughts and give us our call to action, I'm going to turn to George Conway. George, if you can hear me. George is the Deputy Director of UNDP's Crisis Bureau. Please close us out, George.
No, thank you very much, Mark, and good day to all colleagues. I really want to thank everybody for all the really substantive and interesting contributions to the various discussions today. It really has been an excellent discussion, and a number of really insightful issues have been put on the table. So great thanks for that. It's been very rich. And as a result, it's quite difficult to summarize because of the varied experiences across the geographies and themes. But I would like to just highlight some of the key themes just as takeaway messages for us, and some thoughts on lessons that have emerged over the course of today's discussions. And first is obviously on the wide and broad impact of COVID-19 on development progress towards sustainable development goals. The work that Laurel presented on modeling for the future, done jointly with the University of Denver, really does highlight the significant impacts and the real risks on the horizon. And this corresponds with other work that UNDP has done on looking at the human development impact, where we're seeing the largest setbacks in human development indicators since UNDP started tracking human development 30 years ago. And these impacts will get worse unless new and very bold policy choices are made. And then Laurel outlined some of those. Likewise, the results of the COVID Recovery Needs Assessment, the so-called CRNAs, that have been undertaken in a number of countries in partnership with the EU and World Bank, and Hilda spoke to these, have provided evidence that have given governments real basis to make more inclusive, impactful recovery efforts and to prioritize accordingly. And let me take the opportunity then to thank the World Bank and the EU for the importance of the tripartite partnership that we do have. Secondly, focusing very specifically on countries affected by fragility and conflict. We have learned and appreciating the work done by the G7 Plus here and UNDP that the secondary impacts, the social, the economic impacts are even more impactful, and they exacerbate prior risks and fragilities in ways that really do complicate future-looking pathways towards peace and towards development. And this needs different types of approaches very clearly, and a really heavy investment into peace-building approaches modified for the current contexts. Because there's a real risk in these contexts that unless something is done, those at greatest risk already and before COVID of being left behind will find themselves even further behind. And this really does require a strengthened effort from all of us. A third key lesson, as I listen to the country examples, in particular, the cases of Libya, of Iraq, and then the additional comments from the minister in Afghanistan, are the need to address impacts in a multidimensional manner through looking at integrated solutions to support countries on their recovery effort across multiple sectors in ways that join up at a cross-sectoral level. And this means partnerships, and this means working not just across UNDP country, UN country teams as a whole, but bringing in a broad set of development partners to support countries in a much more integrated and holistic manner. And we heard a number of examples of UNDP serving a very positive role in promoting these types of integrated solutions at country level. And this requires efforts across all aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 5 typical categories of addressing people, planet, prosperity, and peace. All of these are essential moving forward. And critically as well, Zaina and others have spoken to the importance of a strong social contract between state and society, and a real strong need for focus on the governance aspects moving forward, as Zaina and others have highlighted. Likewise, appreciation to the critical role that Japan played along these lines, because their very upfront and early support to our responses did enable that type of integrated response to start very early on in the cycle, focusing on issues around the continuity of business operations, social economic recovery right from the start, and a particular focus much appreciated on supporting women, and including women survivors of domestic violence that we've seen spiking throughout. So colleagues, great thanks. It's been really interesting. I do want to thank in particular the G7 for their leadership role on behalf of a group of fragile and conflict-affected countries throughout the pandemic. We do align ourselves specifically with their call, and this is coming out both in the paper that will come out later today, and you'll find it on our website, the Google UNDP Development Solutions, and you'll see both the recordings from these sessions as well as the papers associated with them, but to support the call for a greater international engagement and support to vulnerable populations in countries affected by crisis and fragility as a starting place to recover from the impacts of COVID-19. And to our colleagues from the G7 Plus, we really do look forward to working with you closely moving ahead. This discussion today is part of a series, and I'll conclude on this, because these conversations don't end here. There's much to learn, and there's broader conversations that are happening over the course of the next weeks and months. And for us in UNDP, it really is an opportunity to rethink how we operate differently in these environments, how we bring new thinking, new evidence, new lessons to the table in a way that helps us to collectively elevate our engagement and to with the real opportunity that looking at COVID recovery enables, to think differently about the decade of action and to put us not just back on track collectively, but to actually escalate us further. And it is an opportunity that we need to seize upon, and we do look forward to meaningful engagement over the rest of our development solutions dialogues over the course of the next 2.5 months. So colleagues, great thanks. Mark, great facilitation, very welcome, and look forward to the ongoing discussions. Back over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, George. George Conway there, at the Deputy Director of UNDP Crisis Bureau, had the hardest job actually over the last 90 minutes, crystallizing some really great and disparate thoughts there. So much appreciated. Yes, as George said, this is part of a series of development dialogues. In fact, I'm actually moderating a couple myself next month, two very interesting, interesting discussions. Please join me for that. But I want to say thank you for those that joined us for this very interesting session on COVID in fragile contexts 1 year on. What have we learned? How can we fast track recovery? Well, we learned something over the last 90 minutes indeed, and I want to say thank you. And that concludes this session. Have a good rest of the day.